Hello, Netrunner fans, and welcome to my review of Fear the Masses. This is the sixth and final data pack in the Mumbad cycle. In part 1, we're going to look at the runner cards. Part 2, we'll look at all the corp cards. We're going to start off with a new run event for Anarch. This is Fear the Masses. It's 1 to play, it's 2 influence, it's run, and it's sabotage. Make a run on HQ. If successful, instead of accessing cards, force the corp to trash the top card of R&D. You may reveal X copies of Fear the Masses from your grip to force the corp to trash X additional cards, and then it's limit 6 per deck. Well, ever since Noise, we've known that trashing cards off the top of R&D is pretty strong. And having a run event that goes into HQ in order to do it seems like a pretty good effect. The main problem I have with this is that playing one copy of it is going to be really unexciting. You're almost necessarily going to have to reveal additional copies for this to even be worth it. And I think realistically, you're going to want to reveal multiple additional copies in order to really get the best value out of this thing. I really like this revealing additional copies thing. I think that's a great mechanic, and I think it plays in with the limit 6 per deck thing pretty well. I think like with a lot of other limit 6 per deck cards, this is going to be all or nothing. I don't really see you wanting to play just like 1 or 2 of this for the reason I just described. You're going to be a lot better off if you play the full amount. The big thing with playing 6 of this, I think that's going to be pretty weak early in the game. This is certainly tricky to use, and I don't know what deck I want to play this in, but I think that it's hard to rule out any card that has the effect of milling the corp, because that's just such a strong effect. Next up, we have a new icebreaker. This one's for Anarch. This is Agoura. It's 5 to play, it's 1 MU, 2 influence, and 2 base strength. It's an icebreaker AI, and it's Deva. It has credit break ice subroutine on a piece of ice that has a res cost of 5 or greater. Credit +1 strength. 2 credits, swap Agoura with another Deva program from your grip. Here's the third of the Deva programs, and I think this one is pretty obviously the best one. Being able to break subroutines on the res cost 5 or greater, that's awesome. That's going to be a lot of different ice that you're really scared of. It's going to make this one a lot more flexible than some of the others. The other thing I immediately thought of is that it's reasonably easy with some older cards to increase the res cost of ice. So like Rook or Xanadu would allow you to increase the res cost of ice. That would expand the range of ice that you're going to be able to break with this. And since it has low strength, I think that's also going to make this generally a little easier to use, since you're going to be able to add the cheaper ice into the range of what this can break, and cheaper ice tend to have lower strength. This thing's okay. I think it's probably worth messing around with a little bit. I don't know how much you're actually going to want to use a Deva suite. It seems to me like this is a lot more useful as an addition to an existing suite that has nothing to do with Deva. I think you're going to want to play David with this. I think you're going to want to play Parasite with this. So to me, this just seems like maybe something that you would use as a supplement to an existing breaker suite. Maybe when we get more effects that are based on the swapping, that could help. But I think for now, the stats on these breakers are just not good enough, I think, to really replace the standard icebreakers that we use for most decks. Next up, we have a new resource for Anarch. This is Bhagat. It is 3 to install, 4 influence, it's unique, and it's a connection. The first time you make a successful run on HQ each turn, force the corp to trash the top card of R&D. I think this could be pretty useful in a very HQ-oriented Anarch deck. We have Vamp, Lamprey, maybe Nerve Agent. There are already quite a few card effects within Anarch that are focused on HQ, and if we could stack those all up and really focus on that specific server and still get value on R&D, I could see that being pretty decent. I'm certainly not blown away with this, but I think it could work out in a style of Anarch that we haven't seen a whole lot of recently. Maybe like the Reyna kind of headlock style could use this. I think this is an okay card. I think it might see a little bit of play in that style. Next up, we have a new resource for Criminal. This is the Black File. It's unique, it's 5 to play, it's 4 influence, it's virtual. The Corp cannot win the game unless the runner is flatlined. When your turn begins, place 1 power counter on the Black File. When there are 3 or more power counters on the Black File, remove it from the game. Limit 1 per deck. Here's kind of a power gamer sort of thing. I mean, it's pretty sweet to make it so that the Corp can't win the game, right? But I think this card kind of has some issues. First of all, 5 cost. That's really expensive. And the fact that it's just a resource makes it vulnerable to tags. It also doesn't prevent you from getting flatlined, which I think would be probably the thing that you would want to do the most with this type of card, having some sort of insurance against like a Scorched Earth kill or something like that. So really the only thing this is going to help with is preventing you from losing for the Corp scoring out. That's probably going to mean fast advance or like a rush strategy. And this as a 1-of in your deck is not going to show up early enough in the game where you're going to be able to reliably count on that. On top of that, once you install it, you only have 3 turns before it's removed from the game. We can hypothetically deal with that. The second problem, Dr. Lovegood, you could use him to blank this so you didn't have to put counters on it, and then you would still have the Corp can't win the thing during their turn. Now, of course, if the Corp gets up to, 7 points, then you're going to just have to let the counter go on it, because if you blank it with Dr. Lovegood, you're just going to immediately lose. That's also assuming that you have a reason to play Dr. Lovegood. I don't think you really want to play that card in your deck just because it interacts with the Black File. I have a feeling that this card might make more sense in the future if we see more power counter manipulation, or if there's just generally something else you can do to make this more the centerpiece of how you don't lose. But I think for now, this is kind of just too random and too costly and difficult to use to really be worth it in most decks. The next card is an event for Shaper. This is the Price of Freedom. It's 0 to play, it's 2 influence. As an additional cost to play this event, trash an installed connection. The Corp cannot advance cards during his or her next turn. Remove the Price of Freedom from the game instead of trashing it. I'm really just not impressed with this card. It's going to be really hard to play with the trashing the connection thing. You're going to have to include something like Film Critic or whatever so that you have ammo for this card. Now, maybe in the right deck that wouldn't be as big of a deal, but the main problem I have is that the effect you get is not really that good. In best case scenario, let's say they install Advance, and Agenda, and you don't think you can get into that server, so you get to play this. They can't score the agenda next turn, so then you're going to be able to potentially mount a strike on it the subsequent turn. The main problem I have is in that situation, I think it would be mostly better to play some card that just helped you get through the ice. So like a test run or even maybe like tinkering would probably be better in a lot of those situations than this thing would, because you'd be able to get in and attack that agenda right then. I could see maybe if we have there's sort of an emerging Shaper archetype that banks clicks and then uses them later, like the Temple of the Liberated Mind sort of idea. Maybe in a deck like that, you could utilize this to some kind of advantage. If the Corp installed Advanced and Agenda, it could give you a turn where you bank a bunch of clicks and then you'd have an awesome attack turn. There are hypothetically a few other situations where you don't want the Corp to advance cards outside of just agendas, but I don't really see you being willing to play this card to stop like Ronin or something like that. I don't know, I just think that this is a really narrow and very difficult to play card. Not only do you have to have the connections, but then it also has to have a game context where it does something relevant. I'm not impressed with this. Next up, we have a new icebreaker for Shaper. This is Ankusa. It's 6 to play, it's 1 MU, it's 3 influence. It's an icebreaker and it's a fractor. If you use it to break all subroutines on a barrier during a single encounter, add that barrier to HQ. 2 credits, break a barrier subroutine, 1 credit plus 1 strength, and it has 0 native strength. My immediate reaction to this is that bouncing ice to HQ is way more interesting than destroying ice. Now this thing is clearly much weaker than most of the effects that we use to destroy ice. But most of the ways to destroy ice are 2-card combos. With this, all you have to do is play this as your barrier breaker or supplement maybe to your barrier breaker, and you'll be able to send those barriers back to hand. And also keep in mind that within Shaper, we have a fair number of ways to add the barrier subtype to stuff. That would make it so that we could bounce non-barriers to their hand, and that seems pretty good. Now, the obvious problem with this icebreaker is its stats and its numbers. Not only is it really expensive to install, but it also starts with 0 strength, and you have to pay 2 per sub, which is going to be really painful against things like Spiderweb or Hive. And you also have to consider that this is up against both Lady in faction, you just have to pay that most wanted list point, and then also Corroder for 2 influence. This could maybe be fun to mess around with Dinosaurus or other cards to try to mitigate its primary weaknesses. But I think overall this is probably going to be too expensive and too inefficient for the vast majority of Shaper decks to even consider. The last runner card in the pack is a neutral event. It's called Rigged Results. It's 0 to play, it's 1 influence. Secretly spend up to 2 credits. The corp guesses how much you spent. Reveal spent credits. If the corp guesses incorrectly, make a run and choose a piece of ice protecting the attacked server. Bypass that ice when you encounter it. This has some comparisons to be made to Inside Job, in that it would at most cost 2 and it lets you bypass an ice, though it does have the advantage of you get to pick the ice, it's not just the first one you encounter, which is pretty sweet. The other thing to point out is that this is 1 influence, unlike Inside Job, so if you're playing it in a faction that's not criminal, it's going to be way less of a burden on your influence to play this versus Inside Job. Now this has the obvious weakness of the spending credits thing, the fact that it's not going to work some of the time if the corp guesses correctly, and since you're spending credits, you're going to be a lot more inclined to spend the lower numbers, so I think there's definitely some weighting on the corp's guessing there. And unlike Inside Job, this is going to be a lot harder to plan some sort of sequence of attacks. A lot of times with Inside Job, you sort of hold it and wait until there's a certain turn where you can kind of combo out on them with the sort of criminal attack strike. This, it's going to be much harder to plan on that because if it fails, then your whole turn's plan might be ruined. I could see this maybe making a splash in non-criminal decks as a sort of Inside Job substitute, but I don't anticipate it seeing a ton of play because I think the tendency has been lately to reduce the number of Inside Jobs. Most criminal decks aren't playing the full 3, and I don't know how much the other factions really want that effect with most setups. That's going to do it for part 1 of my Fear the Masses review. Be sure to tune into part 2. We're going to look at all the corp cards over there. There are a lot more cards, and I think, frankly, there's a lot more interesting cards on that side of the video. So be sure you subscribe, give me a thumbs up, and I'll see you over in part 2.